For almost 2 decades, Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban were held up as proof that a marriage between two enormous careers could actually survive. She was the porcelain-skinned Oscar winner from Sydney, a woman who had already lived through one very public marriage and divorce before she turned 35. He was the guitar-slinging heartthrob from Nashville, by way of Queensland, a man who had clawed his way out of small-town obscurity and a real battle with addiction to become one of the biggest names in country music. Together, they showed up at award shows holding hands. They raised 2 daughters as normally as fame would allow. And in interview after interview, they credited each other, sometimes through tears, with saving their lives. Then, in the fall of 2025, it ended. On September 30th of that year, Kidman filed divorce papers in a Nashville courtroom, closing the book on 19 years of marriage. There was no scandal-fueled press conference. No public meltdown. Just a quiet legal filing, 2 words, irreconcilable differences, and a settlement that came together faster and more smoothly than almost anyone following the story expected. By January 2026, it was official. 2 of the most famous people in the world had ended their marriage with what looked, from the outside, like remarkably little noise. But the real story of Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban, how they found each other, what they built together, and why it eventually came apart, deserves more than a headline. It is a story about 2 people who met at exactly the right, or maybe exactly the wrong, moment in each of their lives, and who spent nearly 20 years figuring out how to make 2 very different worlds fit into one marriage. Here is what actually happened. Nicole Mary Kidman was born in Honolulu, Hawaii, in 1967. Her parents were both Australian, living in the US temporarily while her father, Anthony, a biochemist and clinical psychologist, pursued his research. Her mother, Yanelle, worked as a nurse and later as a nursing educator. The family's time in Hawaii was brief. While Nicole was still a young child, they returned home to Sydney, and that is where she actually grew up, in a household that valued discipline and achievement. Here is something that surprises a lot of people. The woman who would go on to command a movie screen with a single look was, by her own repeated admission, painfully shy as a child. She has talked in interviews over the years about turning bright red whenever a teacher called on her in class, about how much she dreaded speaking in front of other people. What she did have, even then, was an outsized imagination and an emotional intensity that needed somewhere to go. She found that outlet first in ballet, then in drama classes, and eventually in youth theater groups, where she could become someone else for a while and say things she could never quite say as herself. By her teenage years, it was obvious to everyone around her that she had real talent. Australia's film industry was growing through the late 70s and early 80s, and Kidman started booking work, first in television movies, then in film, landing a role in the 1983 cult favorite BMX Bandits while still a teenager. She was tall and striking, but it was her emotional range, her ability to access real feeling on camera, that convinced directors she was headed somewhere much bigger than Australian television. By the late 80s, Hollywood had noticed. It was during this rise that she met Tom Cruise, on the set of Days of Thunder. They married in 1990, and for over a decade, they were arguably the most photographed couple on the planet. For Kidman, the marriage brought prestige, visibility, and a certain kind of protection. It also brought real strain. Cruise's involvement with Scientology cast a long shadow over those years, something Kidman has rarely discussed in detail publicly, even decades later. When the marriage ended in 2001, the loss went far beyond a divorce. She and Cruise had adopted 2 children together, Isabella and Connor, and in the aftermath of the split, Kidman lost the kind of daily closeness with them that she had had before. People close to her at the time have said this loss, more than the divorce itself, was the deepest wound of that whole chapter of her life. In the years right after the split, Kidman channeled a lot of that pain into her work. She had already broken through with the stylized, big swing musical Moulin Rouge in 2001, but it was her transformative performance as Virginia Woolf in The Hours that earned her the Academy Award for Best Actress in 2003. By any professional measure, she had turned personal devastation into one of the most respected stretches of her career. But those close to her have said the awards never quite filled the specific gap left by no longer having her children under one roof full-time. It is not hard to see, looking back, why the idea of rebuilding a stable family of her own became something she wanted so badly in the years that followed. By the time she crossed paths with Keith Urban, she was not just an Oscar winner. She was a woman actively trying to reclaim a version of family life she felt she had been robbed of. Keith Lionel Urban was born the same year as Kidman, 1967, in Whangarei, New Zealand. His family relocated to Queensland, Australia, while he was still young, and it was there, in the suburbs, that his personality started to take shape, restless, a little rebellious, and always looking for a way out of the ordinary. His father, Bob, ran a convenience store but had a genuine passion for country music, an unusual taste for suburban Australia at the time. Bob pushed his son toward the guitar early, and by age 6, Keith was already performing in public. Country music, with its constant themes of heartbreak, longing, and redemption, gave young Keith something to hold on to that felt bigger than his own life. By most accounts, things at home were not always easy. Money was tight, and there was real tension in the household, the kind that can leave a kid quietly searching for stability wherever he can find it. For Urban, that search led straight to the stage. Checked out, things moved fast. By that spring, they were being photographed together publicly, and by the end of 2005, Kidman was describing him in interviews as a man who had completely changed how she saw her own future. After years inside the tightly controlled world of her marriage to Cruise, Urban represented something rawer and more unpolished, someone who felt genuinely free in a way she had not experienced in a long time. For him, she represented a kind of legitimacy and steadiness he had never really had, even at the height of his own fame. By November of that year, he was walking red carpets by her side, not just as a date, but clearly as her partner. The tabloids and entertainment press fell for the pairing immediately, two of Australia's biggest exports, finding each other in America, at the exact moment both of their careers were hitting new heights back home and abroad. In June 2006, just over a year after they started dating, Kidman and Urban married in a lavish ceremony at the Cardinal Cerretti Memorial Chapel on Sydney's Manly Peninsula. She wore a Balenciaga gown. He showed up with his signature long hair, looking every bit the romantic troubadour the tabloids loved writing about. The guest list mixed Hollywood royalty with country music stars, but by most accounts, what actually mattered that day happened in the quieter moments. Kidman reportedly walked into the chapel fighting back tears, and Urban sang to her during the reception. To the outside world watching, it looked like the perfect, hard-won ending for two people who had each survived their own version of chaos to get there. Reality, as it tends to do, arrived quickly. Just 4 months into the marriage, Urban checked himself into rehab for alcohol abuse. For a marriage that had barely begun, it was a brutal early test, and it played out at least partially in public view. But Kidman did not pull back. By multiple accounts, she was the one who pushed for the intervention that got him into treatment in the first place, and she stood by him through it, visiting him during his stay and refusing to give tabloids the spectacle they were clearly hoping for. Urban has credited her, repeatedly and publicly, for playing a central role in helping him get sober and stay that way. Years later, in 2024, when Kidman received the AFI Lifetime Achievement Award, Urban addressed this directly in his tribute to her, describing how much of an anchor she had been for him at exactly the moment he needed one most. That early crisis set a pattern that would, in many ways, define the next 2 decades of their marriage. Kidman became the steady one, the protector, the person managing the risk. Urban became someone constantly working to prove, to himself as much as anyone, that he could hold on to the life they were building together. That kind of dynamic can absolutely hold a marriage together for a long time. It can also, quietly and slowly, wear both people down. Despite that rocky start, the marriage held, and the years that followed brought real, meaningful milestones. Their first daughter, Sunday Rose, was born in 2008. Their second, Faith Margaret, arrived in 2010, carried by a gestational surrogate after Kidman had faced fertility difficulties of her own. Kidman has spoken candidly, in various interviews since, about how much she wanted this specific version of family, shaped heavily by the pain of losing daily closeness with Isabella and Connor years earlier. Both continued building serious careers throughout this stretch. Kidman balanced big studio films with smaller, more acclaimed work, picking up nominations and prestige projects at a steady clip. Sprawling epics like Australia, opposite Hugh Jackman, sat alongside quieter, more personal films like Rabbit Hole, which brought her another Oscar nomination for playing a grieving mother. Later in the marriage, she found a whole new audience through the HBO series Big Little Lies, which became one of the defining prestige dramas of its era and added an Emmy and a Golden Globe to her collection. Urban kept touring hard through these same years, releasing album after album, with hits that showcased both his guitar work and an emotional openness that set him apart in a genre that often rewards toughness over vulnerability. He collected multiple Grammy Awards along the way, cementing his place as one of the biggest stars in country music. Publicly, the two of them leaned fully into their image as a couple who had somehow beaten the odds, an Oscar winner and a Nashville star making it work despite distance, fame, and Urban's well-documented history. They spoke about each other warmly whenever asked, showed up for each other at award shows, and gave the public every reason to believe the relationship was exactly as solid as it looked. Privately, according to people close to the couple over the years, it was more complicated than the photographs suggested. Urban's career meant long stretches away on tour. Kidman often filmed overseas for months at a stretch. The two reportedly tried building informal rules into the marriage, like limits on how long they would allow themselves to go without seeing each other, but insiders have long suggested that their schedules clashed more often than the curated public image ever let on. None of that, by itself, is unusual for two people with enormous, demanding careers. What made it harder, based on how people who knew them have described it, was the emotional pattern sitting underneath the logistics, Kidman's instinct to manage, plan, and protect, and Urban's occasional discomfort with always being the one who needed managing. Raising two daughters in the middle of that dynamic brought its own tension. Kidman, shaped by her own experience of a fractured family, reportedly leaned toward routine, structure, and shielding her children from the chaos that fame can bring. Urban, by contrast, leaned toward being the looser, more permissive parent. Neither approach was wrong, and by all accounts their daughters adored both of them, but the difference in style was, according to people close to the family, a quiet source of friction over the years, the kind that rarely explodes into a headline but slowly shapes a marriage all the same. By his early teens, he was playing talent shows and local bars, sharpening not just his sound but the persona that would eventually define his career, part traditional country performer, part restless rock and roll outsider. He left school behind to chase music full-time. There was no plan B, music was the only exit he could see, and he was going to take it. Along with the talent came real trouble. Urban has spoken openly, many times over the years, about starting to experiment with alcohol and drugs while he was still young, and about how fame, once it finally arrived, did not calm any of that down. If anything, it gave his worst habits more room to grow. He moved to Nashville in the early 1990s, hungry for a shot at the big time, and after years of grinding through the local circuit, his self-titled American debut album landed in 1999 and turned him, almost overnight, into one of country music's brightest new stars. He had the guitar skills, the look, and a voice that could turn heartbreak into something audiences wanted to feel on repeat. But underneath the success, his fight with addiction never actually let up. By the time he met Nicole Kidman in 2005, he had already cycled through rehab more than once, and he has said, in interview after interview since, how genuinely afraid he was that his own addiction would eventually cost him the career, and the life, he had fought so hard to build. On paper, Kidman and Urban looked like they came from completely different worlds, Hollywood prestige on one side, Nashville grit on the other. What they actually had in common was less visible but far more important. Both were carrying real wounds into any new relationship. Kidman was still working through the loss of the family life she had had with Cruz. Urban was fighting an addiction he had not fully beaten. When their paths crossed at the Day USA Gala in Los Angeles in January 2005, an event built around celebrating Australians working in Hollywood, neither one of them was chasing a fairy tale. They were just two Australians, born the same year, each quietly trying to figure out their next chapter. By her own account, Kidman did not think much would come of the meeting at first. Urban was polite but reserved that night, and even though they exchanged numbers, he did not call her for months afterward. She has admitted since that his slowness to follow up nearly killed the whole thing before it started. But once he finally as the marriage moved through the 2010s and into the 2020s, entertainment outlets would periodically float rumors about tension between them, stories about disagreements over touring schedules, over Urban's life on the road, over the sheer pressure of running two massive careers out of one household. Kidman and Urban consistently pushed back on this kind of speculation whenever it surfaced, often appearing together publicly not long after a story broke, presenting the united front their fans had come to expect. Every couple of years, a fresh round of "Trouble in Paradise" stories would circulate, usually timed to a red carpet where one of them looked distracted, or a stretch where they were photographed apart more often than usual. Kidman would typically respond by describing marriage as something that takes real, ongoing effort, an answer that sounded modest at the time but, looking back, may have been more honest than most people realized. It is worth being straightforward here. Most of what circulated during those years amounted to speculation, the kind that follows any long-married celebrity couple, and there is no solid evidence the marriage was in serious danger for most of that stretch. What does seem true, in hindsight, is that two people with genuinely different temperaments, one drawn to control and routine, the other pulled toward freedom and motion, were working hard, year after year, to make those differences fit inside one life. For a long time, they actually managed it. By the early 2020s, though, the whispers grew a little more frequent, and a little more specific, stories about the couple living more separately than their public appearances suggested, about Urban being spotted without his wedding ring on tour, about the two of them increasingly steering around questions about each other in interviews. Both continued to publicly insist the marriage was strong. But something, clearly, had started to shift underneath the surface. By the summer of 2025, according to multiple reports, Kidman and Urban had quietly begun living apart. That reporting broke into public view in late September, and on September 30th, Kidman formally filed for divorce in Davidson County, Tennessee, where the couple had maintained a family home for years. The filing cited irreconcilable differences, with some reporting also describing the reason as ongoing marital difficulties. It came after 19 years of marriage, 2 children, and countless public declarations of a love that was supposed to be built to last. What stood out to a lot of people following the story was not drama. It was how orderly the entire process looked on paper. The couple had already worked out a detailed parenting plan for their daughters, by then 17-year-old Sunday Rose and 14-year-old Faith Margaret, with Kidman named the primary residential parent. Reports indicated she would have the girls for the vast majority of the year, while Urban received regular, structured parenting time, including alternating weekends and a split holiday schedule, Thanksgiving one way, Christmas another, each of them getting specific stretches with their daughters built directly into the court filing. Neither party sought spousal support or child support from the other, a detail that suggested their finances, much like the rest of their lives together, had long been kept fairly separate. Multiple reports also indicated the settlement included an understanding that neither of them would speak negatively about the other in public going forward, a detail that says a lot about how they wanted this next chapter to go, quietly, and without turning their daughters' lives into a public battlefield. The full settlement was submitted to a Nashville court in early January 2026, officially closing out nearly 2 decades of marriage. Neither Kidman nor Urban sat down for a big interview at the time to explain exactly what had gone wrong. Both, by every visible sign, seemed far more focused on making sure their daughters were not dragged into the middle of it than on winning any kind of public narrative war. In the months that followed, both of them started to show, in small and fairly quiet ways, what moving forward actually looked like. Kidman mostly stayed out of the spotlight through the rest of 2025. By the time she spoke to Variety in early 2026, she described it as a genuinely difficult stretch, one where she pulled back and kept things close rather than performing composure for the cameras. She has been consistent about not wanting to go into detail about what happened between her and Urban, saying instead that she wants to keep moving toward what is good in her life, and that her daughters remain her absolute priority. She has also said clearly that she has no plans to leave Nashville behind, calling it home after 20 years there, regardless of what happened in her marriage. By early 2026, Kidman was already deep into one of the busiest stretches of her career, reprising her role as Gillian Owens in the long-awaited sequel to Practical Magic, stepping into the role of a medical examiner for the screen adaptation of Scarpetta, and returning for a 3rd season of Taylor Sheridan's Lioness. Her older daughter, Sunday Rose, has meanwhile started building a public life of her own as a model, even walking her first Met Gala in the spring of 2026 with her mother right beside her. For a woman who spent years fiercely shielding her children from the spotlight, watching Sunday step into it on her own terms seems to have become its own quiet source of pride. Urban, for his part, kept touring through the fallout and eventually surprised almost everyone with something nobody saw coming, a new album called Flow State, released in June 2026, that had almost nothing to do with the country sound that built his entire career. Instead, it leaned into a laid-back, yacht rock-inspired style, including a collaboration with music legend Michael McDonald. In the material released alongside the album, Urban described the whole project as one of the most unexpected things he had ever made, saying it felt like the songs had their own energy and that he was simply following wherever they led. He talked about rediscovering how much those old, easygoing records had quietly shaped his own sound over the years, and about wanting to fully disconnect and find something simpler after everything he had just been through. Fans and critics alike seemed almost thrown by the shift. For nearly 3 decades, Urban's identity had been tied tightly to Nashville, to boots and stadium shows and radio-ready heartbreak anthems. Hearing him lean into something as unhurried and reflective as yacht rock, in the same year his marriage officially ended, felt to a lot of longtime listeners like more than a stylistic experiment. It read like a man deliberately stepping outside the version of himself that had existed inside that marriage, to see what else might still be there. He also broke his public silence about the divorce itself in a notably low-key way, posting a short, friendly birthday message to Kidman on social media months after their split, a small gesture, but one that suggested whatever pain came with the end of the marriage, the two of them were at least trying to stay civil, particularly for the sake of their daughters. It would be easy to tell this as a tragedy, or as a scandal, complete with a villain and a victim. But based on everything that has actually been reported, the truth is less dramatic than that, and honestly more human. Two people met at a moment when they each needed exactly what the other one had to offer. For Kidman, that meant someone unguarded and real, after years inside an intensely controlled marriage. For Urban, that meant someone steady and devoted, after years of chasing fame while fighting his own worst instincts. That combination carried them through a brutal early crisis, 2 daughters, and nearly 2 decades of 2 enormous careers running side by side. What eventually pulled them apart was not one dramatic betrayal or a single public scandal. By every credible account, it was simpler, and in some ways sadder, than that: 2 people whose needs, over time, quietly stopped lining up the way they once had. Kidman's pull toward structure and protection. Urban's pull toward freedom and forward motion. For years, those very differences were the glue holding the marriage together. Eventually, they became the distance that pulled it apart. Even so, the way this divorce actually played out, filed without spectacle, settled quickly, reportedly built around not speaking ill of each other, and centered first on protecting their daughters, says something meaningful about what the marriage still meant to both of them, even at the very end of it. There is also a broader lesson in here, one that goes beyond just these 2 people. Fame tends to reward the performance of a perfect relationship far more than it rewards the slow, unglamorous work an actual relationship requires. Kidman and Urban spent 19 years being held up as the exception, the couple who proved love could survive addiction, distance, and the particular strangeness of being famous on 2 different continents at once. Maybe the truest thing about their story is that they were not really an exception at all. They were just 2 people trying, harder and longer than most, to make something difficult work, and eventually admitting, with about as much grace as 2 famous people can manage, that it had run its course. Nicole Kidman is heading into one of the busiest years of her career, stepping back into some of her most beloved roles while watching her oldest daughter begin to build a public life of her own. Keith Urban is doing something he has not done in decades, making music that has nothing to do with the sound that made him a star, and by every visible sign, trying to stay on decent terms with the woman he spent 19 years married to. Neither one of them has offered the world a tell-all account of exactly what went wrong between them. Based on everything they have both said publicly so far, they may never will. Given everything they built together, and everything they are both still protecting, that might genuinely be the right call for both of them. That is the real story behind Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban's marriage and divorce, a story that, honestly, both of them are still writing, in their own way and on their own time. What do you think kept this marriage going as long as it did? Let us know in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, do not forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss the next one.